Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with interesting people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by the founder and clinical director of our landing place, which offers a range of psychotherapeutic services, Alice Curitz. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Alice. So if you could just give us a glimpse of your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a registered clinical counsellor and Canadian certified counsellor, which basically means that I do counselling in Canada. As a proud queer person, I really wanted to work with my community. I also have a background in working with neurodiverse folks, and I find that there's a lot of intersection in those communities. So that happens a lot too. Yeah, basically what I do is I provide online therapy services to folks across Canada, not specifically, although it does come up a lot, but not specifically just to explore gender and sexuality. I do a lot of couples work or partners work. I do a lot of work with folks exploring different relationship dynamics. But really what I wanted to do was create an online clinic where folks in the queer community could come and see a counsellor who they can see themselves reflected in a little bit. So all of our counsellors are queer identified, and we offer a variety of services to the community.
Okay, so our landing place is specifically geared to, as you've said, LGBT plus community, but for people who don't identify within the LGBT plus community, are your services also open for them, or you specifically encourage people just to seek other more appropriate centers for them?
No, not at all. It's everybody is absolutely welcome, and I think that, you know, if you feel like you connect with a clinician, that's going to be really important, regardless of the gender or the sexuality of that counselor. We do specialize in working with the community because there are so many gaps in services. But we also have folks that are, you know, cisgender heterosexual folks that just, you know, felt like there was a connection with one of us and they really wanted to work with us. So we are open for anybody that would like to come work with us.
Brilliant. And of course, I understand, Alice, you're also kind of expanding your work. You're not just focusing within psychotherapy. I did a bit of research, and I understand you're also hosting a conference this coming April. So if you could just tell us a bit more, because I'm sure some of the people watching this would be interested to, you know, get a flavor of the conference that you're hosting.
Absolutely. So the conference is streaming live on April 21st. It's all online. Everything's going to be recorded. So if that's not a convenient time or you're not available for the whole day, it's no problem. You can watch it at your convenience. It's called Queering Mental Health, a Canadian Perspective. And what it is a collection of LGBTQ2S plus identified Canadian people, many of whom are mental health specialists, who have lived experiences of the intersections of being queer and, you know, the mental health system in Canada, talking on a variety of topics, including religion, race, psychedelics, counseling trans clients in a competent way. And so the conference is mostly aimed at mental health service providers, but it's really appropriate for anybody, so all members of the public who are interested in how queerness and mental health intersect within the Canadian system. It's open to international folks who would like to join us to watch it, and there's, I would say, like, most of it is relevant outside of Canada too. But something that I'm really excited about is the fact that every single person that is participating as a presenter or a speaker or an organizer of the event is queer identified and Canadian.
And just to be clear, is this just for academic or for anyone who's broadly interested about LGBT and mental health?
Absolutely anybody, and it's not hugely academic in the way that it's presented, so it's not going to feel like you're in a lecture in grad school or anything. It's very accessible. It's Each speaker speaks for about 40 minutes with a
Mhm.
live Q&A. So if you join us live, you can be involved in the Q&A. If you don't join us live, you can watch the Q&A. So yeah, but it's great for anybody that's interested in the intersections.
So, Alice, the overarching aim of your conference is basically about LGBT plus and mental health. Now, of course, where we kind of understand each other because I'm openly gay and you're also LGBT plus. But for those who don't understand, why is there a need to explore the perspective of mental health within the dynamics of sexuality and being LGBT plus? What's the need for that?
The need really stems from the fact that there are gaps in services because there's not enough of a widespread understanding of the lived experiences of queer folks. I think that for a long time, any sort of sexuality or gender that didn't fall within the cisgender heteronormative box was pathologized. I mean, it was diagnosable until quite recently. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, we had things such as gender identity disorder, which no longer exists in the DSM. Homosexuality was a mental health disorder, which thankfully it is no longer. But I do think that that has influenced how some clinicians show up with their clients. Not all. I think most clinicians are very open and welcoming, but there's a difference between welcoming and affirming. And that difference is a gap in knowledge. And the knowledge comes from the lived experiences of folks who have, had unsuccessful counseling interactions, or who have training in mental health services, and also the lived experience of being queer. And so I think it's really important that we highlight that, because we are a large community and we are a growing community, and the services aren't there to keep up with us. And my goal is that, eventually every clinician out there can be affirming and competent in working with the queer community. That would be the ideal. And so this is just kind of a starting place for how we can really have these conversations and have the right people having these conversations. I mean, I think if we look at medical and mental health systems that exist, they're very normative. They're very sort of a small little box that if you fall outside of that, they don't service you appropriately in all ways. And so we need to start adjusting those systems, and that starts with these conversations.
And I just had a quick look at your the details about your conference, and I understand you have a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm just wondering why you're not included in the speakers list. Is that deliberate, or was there any underlying reason behind that?
Yeah, it's totally deliberate. Partly because in organizing it and moderating the Q&As and all the technology stuff that's going on with that, I think it might be a little bit much to also be speaking. But it doesn't always have to be me that's doing the speaking. I do a lot of workshops and a lot of inclusivity and diversity trainings, and I absolutely love doing that. But there are other folks out there doing incredible things, and I really wanted to be able to highlight other people's voices for this. So it just felt better that I would sort of step over to the side and allow more people to share what they're doing.
Well, we actually have we share a common interest, because aside from running PsychRage, I also host a conference, and I'm really leaning towards a more face-to-face conference, a physical conference. So if I'm not mistaken, this is your first event. So if ever it becomes successful, will it be an annual conference, or would you also be considering hosting at the physical location?
Yeah, great question. So yes, it's going to be an annual conference for sure. We're already sort of in the works of planning for 2022. I'm really sort of on the fence. Like, I love the idea of having an in-person conference and being able to really connect with the community and have that be a thing. But I also recognize that there's a real plus to having this online, which is that folks in rural communities, or folks that have be it financial or physical accessibility needs for travel, wouldn't be able to join us. And so I really love that having it online allows that to happen. And now there's obviously the possibility that it could be an amalgamation of those two things in the future. I think for now it's just going to stay online, and we'll see how that goes. But it would be amazing to connect in person with people too.
Absolutely. And I just want to pick up on what you said earlier, that this will be going to be a Canadian perspective. So what exactly do you mean by Canadian perspective? And do you think that, that will resonate to people from, outside of Canada?
I absolutely do think it will. I think that a lot of the larger trainings, workshops, conferences that happen, particularly in North America, are very much centered in the US. And a lot of us Canadians will engage with those and find them very, very useful. And I think that the same thing will be, I think that folks across the world can absolutely engage with most of the material that's in there will be completely relevant regardless of location. But I do think it's important that we have something that has a Canadian perspective, because there are specific needs. For example, if we think about the Indigenous communities in Canada, those needs don't exist outside of Canada. If we think about the mental health system in Canada, while it might look similar to other mental health systems, it's not going to be the same. And so it's really important to have sort of a focal point that is Canadian for Canadian folks.
Yeah, but nonetheless, everyone is welcome to join the conference, whether you're in Canada or outside Canada. I just want to expand more on that. So if you could just give us like a snapshot of what exactly is the LGBT atmosphere within Canada. Is it more accepting, or how does it compare with other countries?
I would say that generally, like, we're very accepting, very sort of open. There's a lot of bureaucratic or governmental safety and acceptance, and that's really great. But I think that that's vastly different from many people's lived experiences. I've personally had some very unsafe experiences just living as a queer woman in the world. And so, unfortunately, there are pockets, and it's not necessarily the exception. There are pockets in Canada that are not accepting, that are not safe. There's also, for sure, more legislation that needs to come in to really protect our community. I mean, we have, we have different gender options on driver's licenses and health cards. We have more protections at work for queer and trans folks. And I think all of these things are really great, but we also have, a large amount of systemic racism that lots of people don't want to talk about, but it does exist. And that does intersect with a huge, huge portion of the queer community. And so now you might have somebody who's facing discrimination because perhaps they are non-binary and they're in a polyamorous relationship and they're a person of color. And so this is how, this is why it's important to have these conversations about how these things intersect and what this really means for people living their daily lives.
And I would imagine a lot of these things would be spoken about during the conference. No, Alice, you just mentioned, although I'm openly gay, you have to forgive me, and I do apologize for my ignorance. You mentioned a lot of terms that I know is quite embarrassing as a gay person. I'm not really familiar with. You mentioned queer a number of times. I should have asked you what exactly is queer. You mentioned non-binary. I'm kind of aware what non-binary is, but you mentioned polyamorous. Now, I would imagine a lot of people, these would be kind of new terms for them, because just an FYI, a lot of people watching this are actually young people on their early 20s. So it might be also be a new terms for them. So if you could just enlighten us, what exactly is queer folk?
Absolutely. So queer can be two things. Queer can be your sexuality, and you might identify as queer. And, I think that we're expanding terms as we're learning more things, but it can be kind of an all-encompassing I am not straight term. There's also a political part to being queer, which is basically that you don't agree with a cis-normative capitalist structure. And so those are those two things. Typically, I use queer to talk about the LGBTQ2S plus community as a very welcoming and inclusive term. But sometimes it's really important to specifically designate those terms. I do want to touch quickly on non-binary and two-spirit, which is the 2S in the acronym that I've been saying. So non-binary is a gender that does not fall in the binary of male or female. Two-spirit is an indigenous identity that is somebody that has male and female parts to them, or identities, or spirits, and it's indigenous specific. And so I think that, you know, outside of Canada, or even sometimes inside of Canada too, but specifically outside of Canada, that's often not understood, that it's specifically indigenous. And so sometimes people will use those interchangeably. If you're not indigenous, you don't get to be two-spirit. Yeah, and then polyamorous, I think many people have heard of the show Sister Wives. That is not the same thing. That's polygamy. It's not the same as polyamory. But polyamory is also often known as ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. And it's the idea that you can have multiple relationships, and they're not all the same. They might not all be sexual. They might not all be romantic. They might not all be both. Some folks have a primary partner, and then they'll have comet partners or other partners. Other folks don't structure their polyamory that way, but it's the idea that you can have different relationships with different folks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm sure, like what I've said, a lot of this would be covered during the conference. So again, I'll put the link to the description box if anyone wants to hear more about this, about queer and about LGBT plus in relation to mental health. They can sign up to your conference. But just a quick question, Alice. So can you identify some needs which are specific to queer people, which you think is not really specific to the cisgender straight folks?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if we're talking about relationship counseling, you know, I think a lot of the sort of more go-to modalities for doing relationship counseling are very cis heteronormative in the way that they're structured for monogamous couples that are a cis man and a cis woman. And they don't necessarily treat the complexities of a queer relationship and or a polyamorous relationship. And I think that's a huge gap in service. Another thing that comes up that maybe is a little unexpected is sometimes a queer person will go to a counselor for counseling and they just want to deal with their anxiety. And yes, there are absolutely nuances and intersections that might be contributing to it, but they're not there to talk about their sexuality. They might be very comfortable with it. They might not be questioning their gender. But often I think that it's seen as, you know, this has to give you mental health issues. It has to be a struggle. And then the flip side of that is sometimes that we ignore it, right? Canada's a very open and welcoming place. You couldn't possibly face any kind of systemic issue, any kind of discrimination based on your gender, sexuality, race, anything like that you show up with. And so what we want to do is we want to highlight those nuances on where those gaps are, where those misunderstandings are, so that clinicians, whether you're a mental health service provider or you're an educator, or maybe you're a medical service provider, but you can show up with queer clients in a way that is affirming and competent and actually supporting them as a whole.
And so from your own experience, what do you think would happen when a queer person goes to a cisgender therapist who doesn't have background with the community?
I've heard horror stories of people going to clinicians and either sort of just not being affirmed at all, or sort of being directly, unfortunately, being on the direct receiving end of, you know, some not so positive interactions. I think for the most part that is not the case, but I think what happens is that oftentimes a queer person will show up and they'll have to explain every nuance of their identity or their life or their relationship. And it's exhausting. B, it can also feel quite intrusive. And there's a real familiarity with just being able to say, oh, my partner, they do this. And for the clinician to just kind of get that this is not like a man-woman heteronormative straight dynamic that would, you know, so I think that's part of what happens, is that it's not that they're necessarily receiving discriminatory interactions. It's more that there's just a big gap in knowledge, and they're doing the emotional labor of filling that gap for that clinician, and that's not what they're there for.
Thanks for explaining that, Alice. But I have to be honest with you. I come from a different standpoint when it comes to this. I just want to hear what you think that, because personally, I'm openly gay. I'm also Southeast Asian. But when I need the service of a psychotherapist, the least thing that I would look for is, does the person look like me, or does the person have sexuality, have the same sexuality as me? I just want to talk to someone who, who knows what they're doing, they're competent of what, the range of psychotherapeutic services that they can offer. I could not really care whether they look like me or they've got the same sexuality as me. What do you make of that?
I think that's super valid. I think that it's really important that we have clinicians that are well trained, not just, hey, I'm also queer and I want to be able to help people. Like, do you have the training? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the background for that? And that is really important. But I do know that for the queer community, particularly for those who are marginalized, either within the community or within the grand sort of scheme of society, I think that they are looking for a place where they know that they're going to be safe, where they know they don't have to explain themselves, and where they know that the services they're getting are really affirming. And I think that's particularly true for those that are exploring their gender and sexuality, or that are exploring non-monogamous relationships, that they want to be with a clinician who gets it, or who who has some kind of common lived experience. And I think that's a safety piece there.
Another thing that I want to ask you, Alice, because we've exchanged a few emails prior to this interview, and at one point we were talking about pronouns. Within my community, within my immediate community, a lot of people are actually doing that. I respect people's decision, but it's not just for me. But if you could just explain to us, and also for other people who don't use pronouns, what's the need for using the preferred pronouns, or announcing your pronouns, especially on Twitter? You see that a lot.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's interesting because I've seen this a lot from folks who are cisgender, and cisgender, for anyone who doesn't know, is we tend to be assigned a gender at birth based on visible genitalia. So if you have a penis, you're going to be assigned male. If you have a vulva, you're going to be assigned female. And so for cisgender folks, a lot of time they'll say, well, I don't have pronouns. Everybody has pronouns, or a grammatical structure. It's the way that we acknowledge somebody when they are not in the room, or when we're referring to them in the third person. And so everybody has pronouns, and some people do and some people do not share them. So for example, my pronouns are on my website, they're on my email, they're on articles that I write. And I put them everywhere because I think that it's important to open that conversation. And I think that, as a cis person, when I put my pronouns, what I'm saying is I acknowledge that it's important to know somebody's pronouns and not assume their pronouns and therefore assume their gender. It also allows some safety that somebody can say, hey, these are my pronouns, and I can know how to address them, whether they're in the room or not in the room. And so it's definitely, there's been a big cultural shift. And I have to say, like, I hugely credit that to the younger generation and their use of social media. It's definitely shifting, and it's definitely happening. I recognize that some people aren't invested in that. I hope that people will do some research. Maybe they'll come to the conference and they'll learn a little bit more about it. Maybe they'll reach out to their friends that are not cisgender, and they'll find out why that's really important and why that's inclusive. My hope is that it will become much more commonplace for people to do that. It takes less than 30 seconds to update your email signature. When you introduce yourself, to say like, hey, I'm Alice, I use she, her pronouns. It just opens up the floor for some safety for folks to say, hey, this is my name and these are my pronouns, so that people can actually gender people properly and not misgender them.
Okay. Just Alice, let's just go back to the conference that you're hosting. I understand you're really promoting diversity and accessibility. Now, in relation to accessibility, how are you planning to address accessibility needs for your conference participants?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working really hard on that. We are figuring out the best way to have the conference be accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing community, as well as the visually impaired community. And so we're working on some subtitles and some making sure that the slides and the the presentations that are used are accessible visually. We are also very open to accommodating individual needs. And so we have it right there on the conference information on the Facebook event page. But if there are any specific accessibility needs that somebody has, to please connect with me, because I want this to be accessible. So if anybody is looking to come to the conference but they have accessibility needs, please let me know. If you have financial accessibility needs, we have an Angel Ticket and a Pay What You Can program. We have some wonderful sponsors who have facilitated that. And so that is available too.
Brilliant. And just remind everyone where they can get their tickets.
Absolutely. So it's Queering Mental Health, a Canadian Perspective. There is a Facebook event page, and the tickets can be bought through Eventbrite. Again, queering, sort of a neologism, it's a new word, but Queering Mental Health, a Canadian Perspective. Tickets on Eventbrite. You can also get to the link through the ourlandingplace.com website under the workshops tab.
Brilliant. And again, I'll put those links on the description note. Now, we're already moving on to towards the final part of this interview, and I want to take this as an opportunity to get to know more of you, Alice. So I've prepared some questions about you as a person. So is there a particular individual or a piece of writing which has the greatest influence in your work? I noticed that you've got a good stack of books there. Could you share some of books that kind of like shape the way you see the world?
Oh goodness, wow, that's such a big question. I think it's sort of depended on the time in my life and what I've connected with at that time. So one book that I have both of them here. I will just pull them out. So there are two really great books that are not they're not therapy books, which is kind of nice because you don't always want a therapy book. This one is called, let's see if I can get it in the frame. This one is called George by Alex Gino, which is a fantastic story. And actually, Alex has written another book a little bit more recently. And I believe it's already out, or it might be coming out soon. But this is a beautiful story of a young girl who is exploring her gender identity. And it's just a really beautiful, beautiful story. And then this book is Love Lives Here by Amanda Jette Knox, which is the story of her child and her wife's transitions, how they impacted her and her family. She was a blogger for many years before she wrote the book, and she blogged about it along the way, and that sort of inspired the book. And I would say over the last sort of 5-10 years, these two books have been really, really wonderful, because they've been a real privilege to read, honestly, because they've been an insight into a real human being's real experience. So those have been really inspirational for me. Trying to think if there's another book that has been, probably lots of them, to be honest with you, but these are two of the most inspirational for me.
What about the TED Talk? Is there a particular TED Talk that really resonates to you?
There is one, and it's actually not specific to the queer community, but the one on ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, by Nadine Burke. If you see her, she's wearing a red dress in the TED Talk, and you can find it on YouTube. It's very interesting. It talks about how when you hit a certain number of adverse childhood experiences, it changes the chemical makeup in your brain, and it also can have serious impacts on your physical health as well. And we can relate that to sort of anybody who's had any kind of sort of childhood trauma or, really negative childhood experiences. And we often see that with queer and trans youth, that they'll have multiple adverse experiences. I mean, there's a disproportionate number of trans youth in the foster system who get bounced around based on, perhaps they're not accepted in their home, or perhaps they're too scared to come out because they don't know if they'll be accepted in that home that they're in. And so it's really interesting to think about what those impacts look like long term, and how we can actually mitigate those so that youth can have successful outcomes for their lives.
Mm-hmm. And Alice, obviously you've been doing a lot of work in terms of the psychotherapeutic community, within the LGBT community. So what's the big message? What's the most important thing that you want the people to know about your work?
The biggest message and what I'd like people to know about my work is that I'm not special doing this. You don't need to be a member of the queer community to provide competent and affirming services. And being a member of the community does not automatically mean that you're providing those services either. What I'd love for people to know is that this is ongoing. The community is changing. We are learning more about gender and sexuality. We're learning more about different relationship structures, and that it's so important that we keep up our education and that we learn from those with lived experience. I think that we've seen a lot with the Black Lives Matter movement, how it's so important to center the right voices in these conversations, and that, particularly in medical and mental health system models, we've seen a lot of cisgendered, white, middle-aged, middle-class people doing a lot of the talking. And now it's time to make room for the people with those lived experiences to come in, and for the rest of us to sit and really listen and to notice the internal biases that we have, and to make shifts there, to unlearn patterns that are not healthy and are not affirming and are not inclusive, and to notice that, we play a part into those, and how can we shift the way that we show up in order to be inclusive.
That really sounds really a good message, but again, I have to be honest with you about this, Alice, because for me that sounds like identity politics. You're like highlighting, the identity, and sometimes it's not really helpful to focus on your identity. Like me, I don't tend to focus on. Definitely, what you've said, those are valid points. We cannot really disentangle identity from someone's behavior and someone's how they live their life. But I think sometimes we can go overboard. We just focus on identity all the time, and sometimes when we tend to do that, there's something amiss. So I just want to hear your thought about that.
I'm curious what you mean by there's something amiss. What would be missing from talking about that?
Well, you would be missing objectivity, because sometimes you would just be focusing about lived experience, about you being minority, about you being gay. If that's the way that you see the world all the time, I think you're missing the bigger picture. I don't want this to sound political, but that's just my personal standpoint about focusing too much on identity.
I think I see what you mean, and I think that there's some validity to that, in that it would be so lovely if we could all just be humans and we could all just be part of a community. The unfortunate truth, though, is that there are many folks that are marginalized based on their identity or based on just who they are, and those identities aren't chosen. Nobody's choosing their gender, nobody's choosing their sexuality, nobody's choosing their race, and I think that I think that people who genuinely believe, well, we're all equal, I don't care what color your skin is, I don't care who you love, it just is what it is, and I accept everybody, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, but it comes from a place of a lot of privilege. And there are many people who haven't had that privilege because their lives have been directly impacted by their identity, be it that they couldn't get or keep a job, they weren't treated well in the medical system, they've been cut off by their family and have been left with no support system. And so for some people, that's really important, that they have spaces where they can show up safely, or where those lived experiences are valued and are heard. And until we're at the point where people very genuinely are not discriminated against based on any identity that they have, I think that talking about identity is going to be really important, even when it makes some people uncomfortable.
Now, Alice, I could imagine it's quite stressful, the line of work that you do. So I'm just interested to find out, how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Definitely pets. I'm all about dogs. I play the flute, so I like to do that. And just getting outdoors. I love just to go for a walk or go for a run, or I'm very fortunate to live in a place that has some of the most beautiful beaches ever. So when the weather is nice and warm, you'll find me at the beach with my dogs and probably a book.
Brilliant. And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work within the psychotherapeutic landscape?
I would probably be doing what I did before I did this, which is speech therapy and autism intervention. So I'd probably still be doing that.
Okay, brilliant. And finally, aside from your conference, what else is in the pipeline? Do you have any projects that you're working on aside from the conference?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of online downloadable courses that are in the works. They should be released late spring, early summer, and they're all downloadable, self-paced from our website. I also have a lot of panels that I'll be speaking on, and a lot of diversity and inclusivity trainings that I offer to organizations of all sizes across the whole world. So those are things that I also have going on.
Mm-hmm. And for everyone who's watching, who want to learn more about your work, want to connect with you, which social media can they get in touch with you at?
Yeah, you can find us on Facebook. So we're Our Landing Place. I also have Alice Curitz Counselling on Facebook. And then the same on Instagram. It's the same handle. So Our Landing Place and Alice Curitz Counselling. And then you can also connect with me via our website, which is ourlandingplace.com. And my email is there, and I'm always open to connecting with people. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and good luck to your conference, Alice. It's a pleasure talking to you. Unfortunately, our time is up. But I look forward to hearing more about your work, and also all the best to your conference.
Thank you so much for having me.